Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. I'm Nat Kendall-Taylor. Glad to be with you here virtually. Would have been much better to be with you in person, but life and the world has intervened in our plans to do so. I just want to say at the beginning that I've been hearing a lot about all the framing work that's going on in the Alice Springs area, whether that's work of Child Friendly Alice or the amazing work of that's taking place in Kanganjara and Lara Pinta on the Girls Can, Boys Can project. It's just, it's amazing as someone who studies framing and does framing to hear about people actually doing it in the real world and getting into it and using it to advance their work. It's a great thing, and I encourage you all to continue in that work and to frame on. Even though I can't be there in person, I definitely want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you are meeting, the Alice Spring area, the Aranda people, and take this opportunity to pay my sincere respect to elders past, present, and future, and just to express my gratitude for you inviting me to be here, even if virtually. Hopefully next time we can do it in person. A couple of other thank yous. I want to say thank you to the NAPCAN crew for inviting me back, not to this event, but to be part of this week of events, of important events. No offense to the NAPCAN crew, but my second thank you, my more important thank you, is to all of you who are in the room for your time, for taking your time, which is very valuable, and being with us, being with me here today. And I want to say that in exchange for that valuable time, I hope that what I can do over the next half an hour is take your thinking and work and add some value to it with some thinking and work that I've been doing for the last 20 years on framing and framing children's issues in particular. I want to start by telling you a little bit more about me. And I realize that sounds really stereotypical for an American with kind of a typical sense of overinflated self-importance, but I hope I don't have that. I hope I don't suffer from that affliction. What I mean is that I want to tell you a little bit about my disciplinary background, kind of my training and where I come from, because that's actually a really important part of what I'm going to talk about today. So I am not a communications person by background. I'm an anthropologist by background, and I do a particular kind of anthropology, which is called psychological anthropology. And that means that I'm really interested in culture and how it influences the way that people think, how people use culture frequently without knowing it to process information, to make meaning of messages, and importantly, to formulate and reach decisions. So I'm really excited to talk to you about culture and framing and communication. I realize I probably am more excited about this than anyone else in the room, but just you wait. My goal is that at least one of you is at least half as excited as I am about framing by the end of this talk. I think we can do it. I'm going to give it my best shot. And here we go. So what I'm going to do for the next half an hour with you all is two things. I'm first of all going to talk a little bit about framing to establish a common definition of what this concept means and why it is so important in the work that you all do, or at least why I think it's so important in the work that you all do. And then we're going to shift gears, and I'm going to talk to you about 5 ideas around framing, recommendations around framing that I think are really important, always been really important, but seem particularly important given the time that we are in and the issues that we are dealing with. And I'm hoping that these are things that I've selected that you can take with you out of this talk and bring back to your desks as you go back to your day jobs and are thinking about communications and interacting with people about children's issues in general and child protection issues in particular. So without further ado, let's jump in. Framing. This is a concept that, at least in my experience, has become so ubiquitous and overused that I fear it has lost any and all meaning it ever once had. So what that means is that at the beginning of a presentation about framing, we have to establish a common definition of what this construct, what this concept is. So for the next half an hour, when we talk about framing, this is what we mean. We mean the choices that we make and how we present information. So sometimes those are small, seemingly insignificant choices, like the pronouns that we use. Do we say us and them, they, those, or do we say we? And sometimes those are large, more obvious choices, like the values that we use to argue for why an issue matters and why solving it is an important endeavor. So framing is all those choices, big and small, and how they affect the way that people think, feel, and act. So really simply, choices that we make in how we communicate what it is we have to say, and how those choices have effects on people's perceptions, kind of what they think and they feel, and on behavior, what they do. And so to take that kind of out of words into an example, I'm going to give you a quick example of some work that we've done, that we've been working on for a while now in the United States, child mental health. So we work with an organization called the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. It's a group of child development experts who have as their mission taking what we know from science and communicating it in clear, accessible, and actionable ways for people who are making policy and practice decisions. And this is the group that has struggled mightily for a very long time to communicate about the idea of child mental health, to get people, to get members of the American public, policymakers, practitioners even, to realize that young children can have mental health, and also to be supportive of the kind of policies that are necessary to create strong and stable mental health in young children. So our task here was to figure out how you could position, how you could frame messages about child mental health such that people were supportive of those kind of policy solutions. And so as part of that work, we ran an experiment. This is a large experiment. It's conducted with about 6,000 Americans who are selected to be representative of our national population in terms of age, gender, race, ethnicity, level of education, income, residential location, family type, religion, kind of, you get the idea. And the way that the experiment works is that each of those 6,000 people gets randomly assigned to read a particular message. So there's 3 groups that people get randomly assigned to. So person number 1 logs onto this experiment. It's an online experiment, and they are asked to read a passage about a child mental health program. And that passage is framed with one of the values that you see along the bottom of the screen, the horizontal axis. So for person 1, they get randomly assigned to read this value of progress and prosperity. So they would, at the top of this message, they would read something that sounds like, you know, we need to do a better job of supporting children's mental health because, and we wouldn't say it in such a cliched way, but because children are our future, right? Their solid, stable mental health, their healthy development is key to our ability to move forward as a country in a prosperous and successful way. Person number 2 logs onto the experiment, and they get randomly assigned to the value, to the frame of vulnerability, which you see towards the right-hand side of the screen on the bottom. So they read the same, about 80 words about this child mental health program, except the difference is instead of progress and prosperity as the first sentence, they read about vulnerability. So they read about, you know, we need to do a better job of addressing child mental health because children are our most vulnerable citizens, and particular groups of children are particularly vulnerable, and they deserve our empathy and our compassion, and we must do better. Then person number 3 logs on, they get randomly assigned to the control condition. So in that case, this means that they don't read any message. They are the thin 0 line that you see across the middle of the screen that we use to compare the other messages to. And then everyone, irrespective, regardless of what frame, what message they read, answers a set of questions that are designed to measure how supportive they are of a set of, in this case, 12, 15 policies, okay? So what you're gonna see when I click this button is you're gonna see what I think, what the framing geek and dweeb thinks are 2 gorgeous green bars are gonna appear on the screen. And what those green bars are gonna show you is the degree to which hearing these different frames affects people's support for these public policies. So you should see, hopefully, 2, again, they're gorgeous, right? Gorgeous green bars appear on the screen. You should notice 2 things. So that first frame, that first value of progress and prosperity is driving up. It's increasing people's support for this set of evidence-based policies. That's good news. There's a little framing dance that we do. I'm not going to do more than that right now. This is the kind of effect that we're looking for frames have in terms of opening people's understanding and increasing support for solutions. Unfortunately, as I'm sure they did, your eyes wandered towards the right-hand side of the screen where you see the second value of vulnerability is having the opposite effect, right? So it's decreasing, it's depressing people's support for these public policies. So to translate that, if you're an expert or an advocate working on child mental health in the United States and you use the value of vulnerability to frame your message, you not only waste your breath, you not only waste your words, you not only waste your valuable communications real estate, which would be saying nothing at all, right? That's the zero line, but you actually use those valuable resources, and you all know how valuable those communications resources are. You use those resources in a way that disadvantages the very things that you are advocating for. So that's just to be clear, not good news, not what we want to be using frames to do. So the kicker, the really interesting thing is that in a subsequent piece of research, of analysis that we did, where we looked at all of the fields, the sector's external facing communication. So everything that child mental health advocates and organizations were putting on their websites, were writing in their mission statements, were putting out in press releases or op-eds. We analyzed all those materials over a 3-year period and found that over 90% of those materials were using the frame of vulnerability to position their messages. So in essence, what they were doing, obviously without intending to do so, is that they were using those valuable communications resources, not only wasting them, which would be saying nothing at all, but using them in a way that directly disadvantaged their goals, the policies and solutions that they were advocating for. So I've come to think about framing using this metaphor that you see on the screen right now as a key that can unlock thinking. And on the positive side of that, as you saw in the kind of progress and prosperity frame, frames have the ability to unlock thinking, right? To open up places to have more productive conversations, to encourage people to consider the importance of new solutions. That's on the positive side. But on the other side, frames can also play the opposite role, right? We can frame, we can position our messages in ways that shut down conversation, in ways that put up kind of perceptual walls and keep people from engaging in solutions, from thinking about and considering new ideas. And the importance here is really what I'm trying to emphasize is this small but really instrumental role that the way that we communicate has on all of the things that we want to happen as a result. So what we're going to do now, and don't worry, I'll call back that metaphor of framing is key. I think for me personally, it's a really helpful way of thinking about framing and what we can use it to do. But I want to talk to you for the rest of the time about 5 ways of thinking about and doing framing right now that I think are powerful. And again, a number of these come from work that we've done in the United States, but I should say a number of these derive from work that we've conducted over the last 10 years right here in Australia. So the first one, and I think I struggle to say which of these 5 is the most important, but I might say that this one is the most important. This is the one these days in the current context that I'm kind of most interested in and committed to, is that in terms of how we position information, the choices that we make and how we communicate about groups of people are incredibly significant. And there's a lot of, this is not a new phenomenon. We saw this in the child mental health graph, those gorgeous green bars that I just showed you. But there has been, in my country, in the United States, a preponderance of framing around vulnerability in the context of COVID. And there is an incredibly sound and growing body of research that shows that framing groups, whole groups of people as vulnerable is deeply problematic. And that when you frame a group as being vulnerable, you immediately allow people to otherize that group, to see that group as they, them over there, and to kind of reinvigorate or reify the stereotypes that we have of certain groups as being kind of less than, not as good as, through this vulnerability framing. And I would say that most of the time, at least in the kind of progressive circles that progressive organizations that I work with, when this term is used, it's not used intentionally to have these effects, right? This is not the desired outcome that people have when they talk about vulnerable groups, but I think it's really important to say that it is the takeaway that derives from this kind of framing, this continual reinforcement of the way that we think about certain groups of people, the otherization and the stereotyping that occurs, and how vulnerability framing just plays so powerfully into that. The other one that you see a lot of in terms of how we talk about groups of people is kind of savior and victim framing. And again, you see a lot of this in the context of COVID, but I think that you see a lot of this in the context of every single issue we work on, whether that's child protection, poverty, addiction, whatever it is. There is a tendency, again, I think it's in most cases well-intentioned, that we frame kind of certain groups as saviors of certain other groups who are victims. And again, there is a long line of really solid research that shows that when you frame certain groups of being victims, you take power, you take agency away from those groups. And you not only create stigma in people who are looking at those groups, but you actually construct the identity of individuals in those groups through this framing, right? You affect people's perceptions of themselves and influence their well-being by framing certain groups as victims. Also a tendency, and again, a lot of this in the COVID context, particularly with the way that the groups we are working with frame older people in this context. So a preoccupation with demonstrating the worthiness of particular groups of people. And as soon as we frame conversations around worthiness, we invite people to evaluate whether groups are actually worthy of resources, of support. And I hope it's clear that as soon as you get people into the process of evaluating deservingness, conversation is over, right? That is not a productive place that we want to start nor entertain our conversations from. So what we want to do to avoid these traps is, first of all, we want to think about the interconnection of groups and prime that interconnection as a strength, not as a liability, not in the sense that certain groups are not doing well and are kind of weighing the rest of us down, but rather the interconnection between groups of people as an asset, as a strength. We want to, instead of that kind of sacrifice savior framing, we want to evoke a sense of shared responsibility for all. And you've seen some of this, you've seen quite a bit of this in Australia around COVID, but this is an available way that people have of thinking about the relationship between groups that we can take advantage of, that we can prime and frame in a really powerful way. Next, we want to avoid talking about how different the experience of certain groups are, at least at the beginning, and instead try to connect with shared common experiences. This is a very powerful way to draw people who are not normally in conversations into these conversations and create some resonance and productive empathy on a wide range of social issues. And finally, instead of trapping people in this kind of sacrifice and saving framing, we want to ask people to step up. We want to evoke a sense, again, related to responsibility, that everyone has of stepping up and doing the right thing. And this is, I can tell you, a very different way of framing conversations than positioning them in terms of sacrifice and saving, saviors and victims. The second idea that I think is really important, has been for a while, but certainly is right now, is the need to find a balance in our communications between the problems that we emphasize and the solutions that we bring to the table. So normally this is called the balance between urgency, kind of how dire and urgent a problem is, and efficacy. And efficacy is the extent to which we can see a problem as solvable. And so we've seen from a lot of research, going back a long time, but some research that we've done over the last 4 or 5 months, that when you have messages that are all about urgency, right? So data about the crisis, example of the crisis, more data about the crisis, more data about the crisis, that what you do is you kind of reach this state of crisis fatigue, of emergency inflation, whereby people understand that it's a big, heavy problem, but what they do is they just take it and they put it on the pile of other big, heavy problems and they move on, right? You have not earned any of their psychic attention and resources through this. They disengage. Unfortunately, the answer is not to go all solutions and rainbows and unicorns and cotton candy. You call cotton candy something different. Fairy floss, I think, I'm not sure. And when we do that, we create other problems, right? We have people not thinking that our issue is important and therefore kind of losing motivation to engage. People understand that there's a lot of problems. And if you framed your issue as not being one of them, they're done, they're on. And I would argue that in times of crisis, if you don't connect with the difficulty of the situation, people are very likely to just reject your message and not hear you. The answer lies, as it normally does, in balance, is that if we can create messages that take robust senses of urgency, that there is a problem that needs to be addressed, and this is what it is, and this is what it feels like. But to be able to balance those with more aspirational senses of solutions and things that can be done to fix or remediate the problem, we get this kind of ideal, almost magical combination of lean in because of the urgency and get drawn forward because of the sense that there's something that can be done. So I want to give you an example of what that magical balance between urgency and the extent of the problem on one hand and efficacy and expression of solutions on the other. So this example that I'm going to tell you about quickly comes from work that we've done in the UK, specifically on issues of child protection, of child abuse and neglect. And in this work, we were interested in, first of all, testing values and finding out what values did in terms of people's support for policy, their behavioral intentions, whether they volunteered to participate, whether they were willing to donate to a cause, whether they were willing to write a letter on behalf of a solution. And here's how the research went. So on a value, the value of social responsibility in this case, we found that this value was having some positive effect across a range of outcome areas. So it was making people more supportive of policy solutions. It was making them attribute responsibility to systems rather than individuals. It was making them feel efficacious, so they perceived that this was an issue that we could do something about. And it was increasing their intentions to behave in ways that were consistent with solutions. So then we were interested in what would happen if you dosed or added a sense of urgency to this situation. And you did so in a way that members of the field tend to do, which is in the UK on issues of child protection, that entails two things. So that entails both statistics about the prevalence of abuse and neglect, and normally an example, normally that has to do with child sexual abuse, again, to get a sense of urgency and grip. And when you did that, you see that the effect of this otherwise effective value completely tanks, right? It goes away. That when you layer on a sense of urgency, the value is no longer effective in moving these outcomes that we're interested in moving. And this is clearly not good. This is an example of what we call emergency inflation or crisis fatigue, that you layer on the sense of urgency and people become overwhelmed and incredibly fatalistic, and thus are less willing to support solutions, feel less efficacious, and all of these things. So we didn't stop there, and we added to this sense of this very powerful sense of urgency, which was having this fatalistic effect. We wanted to see what happened if you took a set of solutions, in this case, one particular solution about something in the UK, which is called Childline, which is a fairly straightforward child support line that young people can call into and get advice and get connected to services. What would happen to this otherwise unproductive message if you layered on a sense of solutions? And so we added 2 sentences to the end of the message that was tested with a description of this Childline service. And when you do so, again, you see this kind of magical effect, these most persuasive and effective messages. And interestingly, though, they're more effective than just the value on its own. So there's some combination that you can see here between the urgency and the sense of solutions, which is combining to move people on this issue to advance support for the kinds of solutions that people in the field were trying to advance. So the what to do here is to, and this sounds so commonsensical, but the number of times that it doesn't happen, I think, is really amazing. And the strength of the fallback that we have of overemphasizing problems to the exclusion of solutions is really striking and amazing when you look at it. Is if you've got a solution to an issue, bring it to the conversation, right? Don't leave that out of your communications. That is the good stuff. That is the sense that there are things that can be done. That it's not enough just to have a solution to drop it and move on, but rather that we can really fully use the communications potential of that solution if we explain it. If we tell people how doing this thing addresses this problem and leads to this improved outcome, that's magic. That's what you want. That our tone really matters, right? The number of times that we take this kind of doom and gloom, dire and on fire tone when we communicate about our issues. And I would say, not to be overly critical, but fields of child protection, whether that's here in Australia, in the United States, or in the UK, all three places where we do a lot of work, the degree of dire and on fire doom and gloom tone in this field is really is striking. And instead, what we want is we want to have a sense of urgency, but to balance that with, again, this sense of aspiration and solution. And this last one is really important. I've seen people in workshops that we've done kind of go overboard on the solution and get really kind of only overly aspirational. And I think it's really important to realize that it's a balance, right? That if you have, if you've overdone your aspiration without having a sense that there's a bad guy, that there's urgency, that you're not fully taking advantage of the power of these two concepts to be in conversation. So the third idea that really comes out of work that we've done here in Australia on early childhood development in collaboration with an organization called CoLab, which is at Telethon Kids Institute in WA, is the power that we're finding around this value of fairness between places. So sometimes this has been called the zip code argument. And this is the idea that is incredibly resonant for people in Australia and also people in the United States, that the place where someone is born and grows up should not be their destiny, right? It should not be the sole and absolute determinant of how they do in life. And what this looks like in terms of actual communication. So what I've done here is I've taken a piece of communications from the early childhood sector as a starting point, and I'm going to show you kind of how we can use that value in reframing it. Is you take this piece of communications here on the left, which I would argue is being framed with the value. So values are the way that you tell which value is being used is you read a communication and you ask yourself, why does this issue matter, right? The answer to that question is the value that's being primed in the communication. So in this case, when you read this text on the left-hand side of the screen, the value is either early childhood development or science. And I'm going to gloss over a lot of research and summarize it for you. Neither one of those is an effective argument for why an issue matters, especially science. Science tends not to be the best way to get a wide group of people to engage on an issue. Sorry to all the scientists in the room. So if you take this starting point on the left and you reframe it to look like this, you can see that the answer to the question of why this matters on the right-hand side of the screen is this value of fairness between places, right? It is there. It is the overwhelming answer to why this issue is so important and requires our attention. And in testing that we did in Australia, in which we tested this fairness across places or fairness between places kind of zip code value that you saw on the last slide. I'm wondering now if zip codes even translate, but the kind of the argument that place where you're born and grow up should not determine your outcomes or how well you do. When we tested that concept, that value against two other values, which you see in the field, and frankly, one that I thought would work quite well, the value of human potential, that we need to invest in children and families because we want every individual to kind of fully realize their potential, as well as the more economic future savings value, which is kind of sometimes called pay now or pay more later. So we need to invest in early childhood now so that we save money that we are currently spending on other services like remedial education, addiction services, justice and juvenile justice, health system. When you test those three concepts, when you kind of take a large sample of Australians and you randomly assign them to hear these different messages, you find a really interesting and striking result. So that fairness across places value, that argument, is dramatically more effective in getting people to engage with the importance of supporting children and families. Unfortunately, the one that I thought would win, the human potential one, didn't. And quite frankly, this is why it's so important to test these high-level frames and see what they actually do when you put them in front of large numbers of people, rather than just having someone who thinks about communication recommend what he or she thinks will work. So the what to do here is to move from leading with fairness between groups and move to leading with fairness between places. So it's really important on this point that I be clear about something. So this is not me saying that you can't talk about the differences between groups of people, right? So that is something that you need to talk about. That is something that needs to be brought up. The disadvantage that groups experience, the lack of access to resources, the inequities that exist are vital parts of the issues that you work on that you need to communicate about. What I am saying here is that having that be the lead value or prime is less effective than leading with this value of fairness between places. So prime with fairness between places, use that to unlock the kind of conversation and thinking through which you can move into more dedicated and in-depth conversation about groups. The second thing is to move from the kind of current preoccupation with the way that interventions influence developmental outcomes or learning outcomes to a way of framing interventions based on their impact on fairness, right? So you can construct all kinds of really compelling, powerful messages that talk about how certain policies, certain programs, certain interventions either negatively or positively influence fairness between places. And in the research, we found that that is an incredibly gripping, powerful, door-opening way to have conversations. The fourth idea to think about, and this is one that I feel like I've spent most of my career working on, is the power of explanation, right? The realization that our job as experts on issues is not just to throw out a solution, but rather to explain and make people smarter about how issues work and how solutions influence outcomes. And I realize there's a tendency in the way that I say that sounds kind of patronizing or disrespectful to the people with whom we're communicating. And I actually think it's very far from that. Instead, I think it's respectful to the people we communicate with to think and realize that they can get smarter about these issues that we work on, and that it is a responsibility, I would say almost an obligation that we have as people working on these issues to move public understanding and create improved, deeper understanding of how these issues work among a wider range of people outside of our choir, right? Outside of our professional networks. And we've done a lot of work, especially during the COVID time, but certainly before, where we've looked at kind of descriptive framing, which is kind of, or assertive framing, do what we say, right? And over and over and over again, we find that when messages are framed in this way, through the kind of professional lens, like we know, do what we say, two things tend to happen very frequently. First of all, people reject those messages. People question your expertise and reject it. And second of all, they feel in your assertiveness, in your kind of laying out something to do and telling them what to do, they're very likely to disengage. They're very likely to feel kind of attacked and shamed, and thus kind of push those messages away. Instead, if messages can be framed more as kind of see how this works, you make people smarter about how issues work. You create engagement. You create a sense that problems are solvable, and really powerfully and importantly, you increase people's willingness to engage on solutions. I wanted to give you a quick sense of what this do what we say versus how does this work difference, what it actually looks like, and what it actually looks like on issues of COVID, where we've seen this difference really dramatically play out. So the top message is one that I would characterize as kind of a classic do what we say kind of message. So forwarding the kind of call to action that we need to expand this definition of non-essential businesses, the statement that we're currently not doing enough, followed by a do what we say statement, wash your hands with soap for at least 20 seconds. And again, we have found pretty powerfully that kind of a message does not bring people in and along and is categorically less effective than the one that you see on the bottom part of the screen, conveniently coded in green. Green is good, which is a more explanatory, how does this work kind of a perspective. So you can see the difference in the bottom message. It's really explaining what is driving levels of infection. And instead of demanding that people wash their hands, it has an explanatory appeal to that same behavior. So again, similar content, similar goal of the message, but you can see the framing of the two as we compare the top to the bottom are quite different. And the effect of that different framing is quite pronounced in terms of people's reaction, people's understanding, and people's behavior. So we've done some work in the United States, a lot of work in the United States around issues of structural racism, the way that racism is built into American systems and how that leads to this phenomenon of concentrated poverty. That in the United States, people who are poor tend to concentrate in certain areas. And the task of this work is to convince people that it's not just, you know, people who are poor like to live with other people who are poor, which is what a lot of Americans think, but rather to show people that there are structural policy things that are shaping those residential patterns. And so we started off by testing that assertion, right? Structural racism causes concentrated poverty. And you can see kind of positive but pretty meager effects of that assertion. We took that same assertion and we added to it a very short 2-sentence explanation of how policies, we looked at kind of housing redlining policies, lead to patterns of concentrated poverty. And you see these dramatically more effective messages just by adding some explanation to them. So the fifth and final idea that I have been thinking about a lot, and I hope I can leave you with here today, is that we are in a period of flux, right? We are in a period where people's understandings of some very important social issues are shifting, are moving around, are decidedly unstable. And what that means is that the way that we wade into that instability, the way that we engage in that flux, the way that we frame our messages and issues at this time is especially powerful, has the potential to, has the kind of extra special potential to move thinking in some faster and more powerful ways than in normal context. So we've seen this happen in history, that in periods of flux, whether it's in the United States, the Great Depression, in the United States, 9/11, the way that these periods of kind of social turmoil frequently lead to dramatic reorientations in terms of the way that people think about issues. And I think it's fairly straightforward to argue that we are in one of those positions right now. So we see people's understanding of government, and this is certainly going on in Australia, kind of up for grabs, people rethinking the role that government can and should play. We're seeing people thinking about health equity, the way that certain groups of people inordinately experience the burden of in this case, infection, hospitalization, and death around COVID. We're seeing that kind of up for grabs. We're seeing people willing and able to rethink in a fairly deep way about how they think about the economy and work and labor. And we are seeing in a really powerful way an opening in terms of the way that people think about and consider the idea of prevention, the idea that we need to sometimes do things before problems occur in order to create the best outcomes. And this idea of prevention is something that I've been stuck on for a really long time because I think it is so powerful, right? The inability to support preventative policies, to think about prevention, influences people who work on social issues across the board, right? So it hampers the effects of people working on addiction, of mental health, of climate policy, of child protection, of health, of justice. It keeps all of these policies in these domains from moving forward. And there's a lot of reasons why we have problems thinking about prevention. They're both cognitive problems, psychological biases, like delay discounting, which is the idea that we'll always take less now than more later, and kind of how that prevents us from thinking and engaging in preventative policies. But there are also cultural things, our difficulty in getting beyond individual factors to be able to seriously consider and think about systems. The idea here is that framing and how we position prevention and prevention issues right now can help move people's proclivity towards prevention policies forward. And we know this to be the case from other fields. In the United States, over the last 20 years, the field, through the use of a variety of different framing mechanisms, brain architecture in particular, has moved people kind of back in the developmental trajectory and made them able to think about prevention. So in this case, if you start thinking about early childhood development through the metaphor of brain architecture, there's a set of things that start happening, right? You start realizing that working early really matters. You start realizing that the foundation that you build now shapes everything that occurs after. You start having and being very attentive to the importance of timing. And what happens when you start being open to these ideas is that the policy discussion shifts, right? It refocuses on the importance of early preventative interventions. And so because of the importance of this issue and the opening that currently exists, I'm really excited to announce the fact that that NAPCAN and Frameworks are launching a major new research project that is designed to develop and test new, more effective ways of framing prevention. And this project is going to look at a series of really important questions from an empirical research perspective. What are the obstacles to prevention that policies in Australia face? What do members of various sectors who work on preventative policies want to be able to say about prevention? How do people, both public and policymakers, think about these issues? Importantly, what is the new story that we can tell about prevention that moves these issues forward, that kind of unlocks this potential? And last but not least, once we have a new story, what is the way what are the ways that we can get it out and have it in front of people? And I hope that everyone can become involved in this project. It is certainly a collaborative and very open endeavor. And I'm incredibly grateful for NAPCAN and their partnership on this work. I am incredibly excited to begin this. I have been wanting to do this project on prevention for probably 10 years now, and am incredibly excited and optimistic about its potential. So I want to end with my new favorite quote about framing, which is from a guy named Charles Eisenstein, who said that the world as we know it is built on a story. To be a change agent is first to disrupt the existing story of the world, and second, to tell a new story of the world so that people have a place to go. And I derive a great deal of inspiration from this quote. I hope it connects with you all as well. I will thank you all very much for your time and encourage you to continue to frame on. Thank you very much.